Hello, this is the second video of my analysis on The Plot Against the Giant by Wallace Stevens. Before proceeding in the analysis, I wanted to go back and revisit some points I made about the first girl in the first stanza. First, how the first girl uses the giant's sense of smell against him. Of course, there's this seduction by the familiar, represented by the geranium, and the exotic, representing the unsmelled flowers. The unsmelled flower can also refer to her and what she could offer him sexually, but has not yet disclosed to him. It occurs to me that I probably didn't talk about the fundamental sexual nature of flowers. Flowers, as I wrote here, are sexual organs that attract insects, which unwittingly communicate pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma and ultimately to the ovary of another. I guess you could say that the insects are seduced into doing it. I spoke of how perspective is essential in the stanza as well, as she says that I will run before him with these either odors of the flowers or the flowers themselves, which I'll get to in a moment. In which case, by her very motion, she is creating a trail of scent, which at some point the giant will sense, and that will have certain effects on him. But I want to, as I said, talk about the reality of what's being alleged or planned. Now, distance is used, at the very least by the first girl, as a means by which to defeat, in ways that we've already said, the giant. The choice of a geranium being common is close. It abounds. It's within the range of smell of everyone. Whereas unsmelled flowers are not specified, but to be unsmelled, they're going to they're going to have to be at a distance from everything. Now, if the giant is a giant, he's a giant of sense too. So we would imagine that his ability to smell far exceeds, far outspans the ability of a normal being, a normal man, to smell, to sense flowers. Now, the question of the reality. Now, on the one hand, it says that she is diffusing odors out of geraniums and unsmelled flowers. That, of course, could mean that she is holding a geranium and some unsmelled flowers. Of course, the problem if she's holding it is that they're close. How can you claim that flowers that you would be able to smell are unsmelled? They clearly are. They have been smelled. And also, if she's running, it creates a problem of weight and encumbrance. Imagine a girl running with these flowers and not tripping, not stumbling. There's no sign that she's struggling with this whatsoever. But the more fundamental problem is how could you possibly say that the geraniums are closer and the unsmelled flowers are farther when it's limited by the relative inability of the arms to stretch beyond a certain point. So we would have to imagine that there was extreme unreality in this, in that her arm would have to stretch miles or hundreds of miles away in order to accomplish what I think she's trying to accomplish. However she manages it, she's running ahead of him. And so the idea would be that at a certain point he can smell the most distant, the impossibly distant flowers, but the very fact that she's moving away should move those flowers even further to the point where even he can no longer smell them any longer. What does this represent? This would mean that a threshold for his sense of smell was established, and there would locate him within a extreme range, a continuum of all possible abilities. So this limits him. A giant would almost seem to be something that does not exist within a range that we can remotely relate to. But now he's been planted, and he is comparable to us and us to him, and in this sense, he has been contained to a degree, at least contained to the degree as a king who has found himself in check and has had to remove himself. Now let's look closely at the role that the second girl plays in the plot. I shall run before him, arching cloths besprinkled with colors as small as fish eggs. The threads will abash him. So notice I shall run before him, just as the first girl did. The before suggesting that she is standing in front, perhaps, as one stands before a king and presents something, or also opposes him. But of course, she's running, she's not standing. So, in that sense, she's running ahead of him, uh, perhaps with the same aim as the first, to lead him astray, to seduce him, to also work to contain him in some way that we don't know yet. Now, she says that you will be arching cloths. A cloth is a woven fabric, a fabric consisting of threads, and ones that can have a can have myriad uses, but they're generic here. They're just cloths. Now, before I talk about what the cloths have been sprinkled with, I want to talk about this word arching. Now, I imagine that if she's holding this cloth and she's running with it and she's arching it, the arching is in part because she's, let's say, holding the cloth with two hands. That makes the most sense. And it's also arching as a function of as she runs, it's creating drag against the air around her. So I think reality asserts itself to a far greater degree with the second girl than the first girl. Now, there's a consequence to drag. If all else being equal between the two girls, if the two girls can run as fast as one another, who's to say that they can't, that means this drag should slow her down. But then we see she's not just arching a cloth, she's arching cloths. Now, of course, here realism gets challenged a little bit because you wonder, well, how would she manage that? How do you manage two, three, four? We don't even know how many cloths there are. Let's say two or three. If you had additional cloths here and here above her, you could imagine the amount of drag would almost slow her down to a standstill. Now I know that the first girl checked the giant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he had to retreat. If he retreated, the retreat was temporary, but then he can come back in another direction. So perhaps he's moving just as fast as he was before, but if she's moving more slowly, that has to affect the plot, and that has to also inform her role. Now let's talk about the cloths themselves. The cloths themselves are not just a cloth here, but they're a surface for colors. They are said to be besprinkled with color. Now, when we talk about sprinkling something, I think of having my two fingers together and picking up a powder and sprinkling it like so. Thank goodness for the airbrush function on paint. So what I did is I showed you maybe how colored powders could be added to the surface. And the point about powders too, the particles within powders are infinitesimally small, and perhaps even smaller than would be suggested here. Well, the question, if this was a question that was in the reader's mind, then the poem immediately answers it. How small are these particles? Well, it says they're as small as fish eggs. Well, at first I just kind of took that in stride, but then I thought, well, what do fish eggs look like? This is obviously a knowledge limitation of my own. I'm no cook, I'm no gourmand, I'm no foodie. So I was actually quite surprised to see that a fish egg, albeit small, is actually pretty big. It doesn't look like something that I could easily sprinkle. Of course, if you held those fish eggs farther and farther and farther away from me, they would lose their distinct shapes and they would just turn in not to particles of color, but just color. Now, here as well, I'm going to talk about the perspective of the giant, which is awfully difficult because the reality of distances is not really maintained in this. As I said, it's more so with the first girl, But when I say that the giant is behind her, we don't know how far. But at a certain point, let's say that there's a certain distance, and the giant is looking at this, let's call it a painting, and he sees color. But then, as he gets closer, we said that as a consequence of the drag, he is moving about the same speed, but she's slow. She's being held back by the drag uh, that is caused by the interaction of, of the cloth against the air. But as he gets closer to her, what maybe just appeared to be color now appears to be particles the size of fish eggs. So even in his giant sight, there is a range of possibilities. Even for him, at a certain distance, a color will just be continuous. But as it gets closer, you will actually be able to see the giant, we, and he will all be able to see the fact of the atoms, the particles of color that comprise what originally seemed to be a continuous, harmonious whole. Now, would the giant appreciate this difference? Would he appreciate that at a certain distance he sees continuous color, and at a closer distance he sees the particles of color that make it up? Well, not necessarily, unless we talk about pointillism. Now, here's probably one of the most famous pointillist paintings, Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. For those of you who came of age like I did in the 1980s, and you saw Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you'll remember that impressive scene where Cameron's at the museum. He's looking at this painting, and he is looking closer and closer and closer at the child. And whether it's horror or bemusement, amazement, awe, he sees that child disappear into little splotches of painting, which is really the point of pointillism. Now maybe we can give the flavor of this using an extreme close-up. So here's the little girl, and as we get closer and closer to her, her face disappears. It becomes indistinct. Now, of course, this would be true of any painting. Obviously, you lose resolution, but the loss of resolution is particularly well foregrounded by this painting style. So just as in the case of the first round of the plot, the first girl, we see that the giant has limitations to his abilities. We see that there's a threshold at which the continuous color gets resolved into these individual dots. Now, just as we saw before with the face of the girl becoming indistinct, well, that would mean that as when the giant was at a relative distance, he would not only see colors, he would see an image, he would see a painting, he would see something recognizable. But then when he got too close to it, just as with anybody else who got too close, whatever too close for us and with our relative powers of seeing are, he is going to lose the image. And I believe this is what abashes him. Again, the notion he has been put in a position where he doesn't merely see a loss of his own abilities. That he clearly does. He cannot see the he cannot see the painting, the image any longer. It turns out he's simply governed by the same rules of perspective as the rest of us, which is then another blow to him. He's not merely a giant with his own gigantic ranges. He's governed by the same laws of perspective as the rest of us. So this is a steady diminishment of the giant. Now, in addition, so it's bad enough to see that he's bound by the same rules that we are in terms of being able to see an image in a painted image. He's able to see the threads. So as he gets even closer, his vision allows him to see the very threads that make up these cloths. The cloths are not continuous whole objects. They actually are made up of threads, and into threads they can unravel. and one could imagine that his sight could take him even further to actually an abyss where all things fall apart. And this is said to abash him. This is deeply disconcerting and perhaps even brings a blush to his cheeks. Of course, there could be something else that abashes him too. I'd like to go back to the fish eggs. Now, in the first stanza with the first girl, the odors of flowers suggest that strategy by which flowers attract insects and turn them into intermediaries, the agents of pollination that enable uh, flower reproduction to occur. Here, we've gotten, in an evolutionary sense, closer from flowers to other animal species. And I found this wonderful diagram when I was Googling fish eggs. And also, one thing that really struck me is that, though, notice how the female fish is almost sprinkling her fish eggs along the bottom, and the male is traveling behind her and will likewise sprinkle semen, perhaps, or will inseminate the flowers. Now, this is clearly we would say in terms of this is not a particularly romantic picture, uh, but certainly it is more relatable. It's more at a distance. It's keeping us at a distance, but it's strongly suggesting the reproduction upon which we our perpetuation guarantees, and suggests the ways in which we go about attracting mates and becoming pregnant. In a sense, this is what sex boils down to. And this very fact could abash him in the same way that what underlies the painting and the canvas are these threads. Uh, is almost I almost want to call them the dumb matter upon which everything out of which everything else arises. The very romance, if you call it this, or the chase, fundamentally comes down to one fish inseminating the eggs left behind by the other fish, and creating the spawn. So, to recap, in the first stanza, the role of the first girls seems to be to put constraints, either for her own amusement, to see how the powers of the giant are limited, or we would imagine likewise to for the giant himself to begin to get a sense that he too is limited. And then with the second girl, um, while we ultimately can talk about the giant's ability to see and to see down deep into the nature of things, maybe uh, looking at them as being you know grittily unpleasant, but also to simply make the giant aware that he too is bound by the same rules of perspective as the rest of us. So it's as though he's being slowly but surely led into a trap from which he won't be able to escape, um, which we'll talk about in the next video. Thanks.